The butler entered the dining room at Chequers, carrying a portable radio, the kind with a wooden case and fabric speaker grill that families gathered around in their parlors. Winston Churchill looked up from his plate. It was 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening, December 7th, 1941, and the Prime Minister of Great Britain had been entertaining American guests at his country residence. Averell Harriman, President Roosevelt's personal envoy, sat to his right. John Winant, the American ambassador to Britain, was also at the table. They'd been talking through dinner, the conversation touching on the war, on politics, on the endless question that dominated Churchill's every waking hour: how to bring America into the fight. The butler set the radio on the sideboard and switched it on. The BBC 9 o'clock news was beginning. Churchill continued eating, half listening, expecting the usual reports from North Africa, from the Atlantic, from the bombing campaigns. Then the announcer's voice cut through the room with words that made Churchill's fork pause halfway to his mouth. Japanese aircraft had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Churchill stopped moving. Harriman and Winant looked at each other, then at Churchill. The announcer continued, but the details were fragmentary, confused. An attack on the American Pacific Fleet, bombs falling on ships in harbor. The scope still unclear, but the fact itself undeniable. Japan had struck at America. Churchill stood up from the table. His face, which had carried the weight of 2 years of solitary struggle, suddenly shifted. Not shock, not surprise at Japan's aggression. He'd expected that. But this changed everything. He turned to Winant and said they must call the president immediately. Winant nodded, already moving toward the telephone. As Churchill walked from the dining room, his mind was racing through the implications faster than the fragmentary radio reports could deliver them. For 29 months, since France had fallen in June of 1940, Britain had fought on alone. The Commonwealth stood with her: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa. But the industrial and military might that could truly defeat Nazi Germany lay across the Atlantic in a nation that had chosen neutrality. Churchill had courted Roosevelt, had written him letters, had sent envoys, had made speeches broadcast to American audiences. He had received Lend-Lease aid, which kept Britain supplied and fighting. But America herself remained out of the war, and now Japan had solved that problem for him. Churchill reached the telephone as Winant was already speaking to the White House operator. The connection took a few minutes to establish. Transatlantic calls in 1941 required routing through multiple operators, cables laid across the ocean floor. Churchill waited, pacing. When Roosevelt's voice came through, Churchill asked him directly, "Was the news true?" "It's quite true," Roosevelt said. His voice was calm but strained. "They have attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We are all in the same boat now." Churchill felt something release in his chest that had been clenched tight since May of 1940, when he'd become Prime Minister and inherited a war Britain was losing. He asked Roosevelt about casualties, about damage, but Roosevelt didn't yet have full details. The attack had happened only hours ago, in the afternoon Hawaiian time. Reports were still coming in, but the scale was clearly enormous. Multiple battleships hit, hundreds, perhaps thousands of casualties. The Pacific Fleet had been caught completely by surprise on a Sunday morning. Churchill expressed his shock and sympathy, but inside, beneath the genuine horror at American deaths, ran a current of relief so profound it bordered on euphoria. He knew what this meant. America would declare war, not just on Japan, though that was certain, but Germany would likely declare war on America in response, or America would find her way into the European war through the connection of the Axis alliance. Either way, the industrial power of the United States, her millions of potential soldiers, her factories and shipyards and arsenals, would now be thrown into the balance. Britain would not fall. The war could be won. After he hung up with Roosevelt, Churchill returned to his guests. The radio was still on, repeating the same fragmentary reports, adding small details as they arrived from across the Atlantic. Harriman and Wynant looked shaken. Their country had just been attacked. Churchill, by contrast, seemed almost energized. He told them what Roosevelt had said. He began to discuss the implications. The conversation went late into the night. Churchill would later write in his memoirs about that evening, about the moment he heard the news. His first thought, he admitted, was simple and overwhelming. So we have won after all. Not we might win or we have a chance. Simply, we have won. He understood immediately and completely that American entry into the war made Allied victory inevitable. It would take years, it would cost millions more lives. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. He went to bed that night, he wrote, and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. But even as Churchill slept, the full scope of what Japan had done was still emerging. Pearl Harbor was not an isolated attack. It was the opening move in a coordinated offensive that spanned the entire Pacific and Southeast Asia. While American battleships burned in Hawaii, Japanese forces were striking across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. In Malaya, Japanese troops had actually begun landing at Kota Baru on the northeast coast before the Pearl Harbor attack, owing to time zone differences. The landing started just after midnight local time, which was still Sunday afternoon in Hawaii. By the time Churchill heard the BBC report at 9 in the evening, London time, Japanese soldiers were already fighting British and Indian troops on Malayan beaches. In Hong Kong, Japanese forces attacked across the border from mainland China. The garrison there, a mix of British, Canadian, and Indian troops, was heavily outnumbered and cut off from reinforcement. They would hold out for 18 days before surrendering on Christmas Day. In the Philippines, Japanese aircraft struck American airfields at Clark Field and other bases. Despite having hours of warning after Pearl Harbor, American planes were caught on the ground and destroyed in neat rows. General Douglas MacArthur's Air Force was crippled in a single morning. In Thailand, Japanese troops invaded at multiple points, quickly overwhelming the small Thai army. The Thai government, recognizing the impossibility of resistance, would soon sign an alliance with Japan. Wake Island, a tiny American outpost in the Pacific, came under attack. The small garrison of Marines would hold out for 2 weeks before being overwhelmed. Guam, another American possession, was attacked and would fall within days. Singapore, the great British naval base that was supposed to be the Gibraltar of the East, was bombed on the first day. The bombs fell on the city, killing civilians, starting fires, shattering the illusion that Singapore was safe behind its great naval guns. The Japanese were not just attacking, they were executing a carefully coordinated plan to seize control of the entire Western Pacific and Southeast Asia in one massive offensive. They struck at every major Allied position simultaneously, seeking to cripple resistance before it could organize. Churchill woke on Monday morning, December 8th, to more complete reports. The news was uniformly bad. Pearl Harbor had been devastated. 8 American battleships had been hit, some sunk, some damaged. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed. The Pacific Fleet's battle line had been effectively eliminated in a single morning, and the attacks were continuing. More reports arrived through the morning. The scale of Japanese aggression was breathtaking. Churchill called an emergency meeting of the War Cabinet. They gathered in the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street, the same room where Churchill had met with his ministers through the darkest days of 1940 when invasion seemed imminent. But this meeting had a different character. Yes, the news was bad. Yes, British forces were under attack across Asia. Yes, Hong Kong would likely fall, and Malaya was in danger. But America was in the war. Churchill's ministers could see it in his face, hear it in his voice. The strategic situation had been transformed overnight. At 3:30 that afternoon, Churchill went to the House of Commons to address Parliament. The chamber was packed. Members knew something enormous had happened, but many didn't yet grasp the full scope. Churchill stood at the dispatch box, his characteristic bulldog stance, and began to speak. He described the Japanese attacks, the treachery of striking without warning, the coordination of the offensive. He announced that Britain was declaring war on Japan. The vote was unanimous, immediate. But Churchill's speech went beyond the formalities of declaring war. He spoke about what this meant for the broader conflict. "We have at least 4/5 of the population of the globe upon our side," he said. "We are responsible for their safety and for their future. In the past, we have had a light which flickered. In the present, we have a light which flames, and in the future, there will be a light which shines over all the land and sea." The members of Parliament understood. America was in. The light that had flickered through 1940 and 1941, when Britain fought alone, was now aflame, and that flame would become a blaze that would consume the Axis powers. But even as Churchill spoke with confidence about the ultimate outcome, he knew the immediate future would be difficult. The Japanese had achieved complete surprise. Their attacks had been devastatingly effective. Allied forces across the Pacific were reeling. 2 days later, on December 10th, news reached London that shocked Churchill more than Pearl Harbor had. The battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse had been sunk by Japanese aircraft off the coast of Malaya. Both ships had been sent to Singapore to deter Japanese aggression, to show British power in Asian waters. Now they were at the bottom of the South China Sea. Over 800 sailors were dead, including Admiral Tom Phillips, who had commanded the small fleet. Churchill was in bed when the call came with the news. His personal secretary, John Martin, brought him the message. Churchill read it in silence, then said simply, "Are you sure it's true?" Martin confirmed it was. Churchill turned his face to the wall. In all the war, Martin would later say, he had never seen Churchill so stricken. The loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse meant British naval power in the Pacific was effectively finished. Japan controlled the seas around Malaya and the Philippines. Singapore's great naval guns, which pointed out to sea to defend against naval attack, were useless against an enemy coming overland through the Malayan jungle. And the Japanese were coming fast. Their troops, experienced from years of fighting in China, moved through terrain the British had considered impassable. They used bicycles to move quickly down roads. They infiltrated through jungle. They outflanked defensive positions. British, Indian, and Australian troops fought hard, but they were being steadily pushed back down the Malayan Peninsula towards Singapore. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces were also retreating. MacArthur's army fell back to the Bataan Peninsula, where they would hold out for months in increasingly desperate conditions before surrendering. Hong Kong's garrison fought with courage, but no hope. The city was indefensible against the overwhelming Japanese forces attacking from the mainland. On Christmas Day, 1941, the garrison surrendered. British soldiers, Canadian soldiers, nurses, and civilians entered Japanese captivity. Wake Island's tiny marine garrison held out for 15 days, even repelling the first Japanese landing attempt. But on December 23rd, overwhelmed by a second, larger assault, they too surrendered. Guam fell quickly. Thailand became a Japanese ally. The entire structure of Allied power in the Pacific and Southeast Asia was collapsing. But through all of this, Churchill maintained his fundamental confidence. Yes, the immediate situation was catastrophic. Yes, Singapore would likely fall, though he didn't yet admit that publicly. Yes, the Japanese were winning every battle. But America was in the war, and that changed the mathematics of victory. On December 11th, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler made Churchill's strategic calculation even simpler. Germany declared war on the United States. Hitler was not required to do this by his alliance with Japan. The tripartite pact was defensive, and Japan had clearly attacked first. But Hitler, believing America was already an enemy in all but name, and hoping to unleash his U-boats against American shipping without restriction, declared war. Churchill could hardly believe his fortune. Now there was no ambiguity, no question of America fighting only Japan while staying neutral in Europe. Germany had declared war on America. America would fight in Europe. The grand alliance that Churchill had dreamed of, Britain, America, and Soviet Russia together against the Axis, was now reality. Churchill immediately began planning a trip to Washington. He needed to meet with Roosevelt to coordinate strategy, to ensure that America's enormous resources were directed properly. He sailed on December 12th aboard HMS Duke of York, crossing a North Atlantic still prowled by German U-boats. The crossing took 9 days. He arrived in Washington on December 22nd and spent Christmas at the White House with Roosevelt. The two leaders, along with their military staffs, worked through the holidays planning the war. They agreed on Germany first, the strategic decision that defeating Nazi Germany was the priority, and Japan would be contained and then defeated afterward. They planned the command structure for Allied forces. They discussed production targets for ships, aircraft, and tanks. They coordinated diplomatic efforts. Churchill addressed a joint session of the American Congress on December 26th. He stood before the assembled senators and representatives and spoke about the war, about the alliance, about the certainty of victory. "What kind of people do they think we are?" he asked, referring to the Axis powers who thought they could defeat the democracies. The Congress erupted in applause. On New Year's Day, 1942, Churchill and Roosevelt signed the Declaration by United Nations, a document that 26 nations fighting the Axis powers endorsed. It was the foundation of what would become the United Nations organization after the war. But more immediately, it was a statement of unity and purpose. The Allies were together, coordinated, committed to fighting until the Axis was defeated. Churchill returned to Britain in mid-January. The news from Asia was still bad. The Japanese continued their advance through Malaya. Singapore was now under direct threat. Burma was being invaded. The Dutch East Indies were under attack. The entire European colonial structure in Asia was collapsing. On February 15, 1942, Singapore surrendered. Over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops went into Japanese captivity. It was the largest surrender in British military history. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. But even this catastrophe didn't shake his fundamental confidence about the war's outcome. Singapore's fall was a humiliation, a tragedy, a disaster. But it didn't change the strategic reality. America was in the war. Soviet Russia, despite enormous losses, was still fighting and tying down the bulk of German forces. Britain controlled the seas around Europe. The Axis powers had reached their maximum extent. From now on, slowly at first, but with gathering momentum, the Allies would push back. Churchill understood something that evening at Chequers on December 7th, something he grasped in the moment he heard the BBC announcer's voice report the attack on Pearl Harbor. The war had just become winnable. Not easy, not quick, but winnable. Everything that came after, the disasters in Asia, the continued fighting in North Africa, the grinding struggle in Russia, the U-boat war in the Atlantic, all of it would be fought with the certain knowledge that the Allies had the resources to win. America's factories would produce more ships than the U-boats could sink. America's training camps would produce more soldiers than the Wehrmacht could kill. America's shipyards would build the landing craft that would carry Allied armies back to France. Japan's conquests in early 1942 were spectacular, but ultimately hollow. They had seized a vast empire, from Burma to the Solomon Islands, from the Dutch East Indies to Wake Island. But they had also guaranteed their own defeat by bringing America into the war. The industrial capacity of the United States was greater than Japan's by a factor of 10 or more. Once that capacity was fully mobilized and directed at Japan, the outcome was inevitable. Germany's declaration of war on America was an even greater strategic blunder. Hitler had already failed to defeat Britain. He had invaded Russia and become bogged down in a war of attrition he couldn't win. Now he added America to his list of enemies. The combined industrial and military power of Britain, America, and Russia was simply too much for Germany to overcome. Churchill saw all of this in the moment he heard about Pearl Harbor. His military experience, his strategic understanding, his grasp of industrial economics all told him the same thing. The Axis had just lost the war. It would take years to play out. Millions more would die, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. That's why he could sleep the sleep of the saved and thankful that night. Not because the immediate news was good. It was terrible. Not because British forces weren't in danger. They were. But because the fundamental strategic situation had shifted from uncertain survival to certain victory. The butler who brought the radio into the dining room at Chequers that evening couldn't have known he was carrying the instrument that would deliver the news Churchill had been waiting for since he became Prime Minister. The BBC announcer reading the bulletin couldn't have known his words would trigger such relief in the man listening at a country house in Buckinghamshire. Roosevelt, speaking to Churchill on the phone that night, couldn't have fully grasped how much weight lifted from his friend's shoulders with the words, "We are all in the same boat now." But Churchill knew. In that moment, hearing that Japan had attacked America, he knew. The war would be long. The casualties would be horrific. The cost would be staggering. But Britain would survive. The Nazis would be defeated. Democracy would endure. So we have won after all. 4 simple words that captured everything Churchill felt in that moment. Not triumph at Pearl Harbor. The attack was a tragedy for America. Not joy at the suffering of American sailors. Their deaths were a horror. But relief, profound and overwhelming, that the long, solitary struggle was over. That Britain would not fall. That the cause would not be lost. He had carried the burden of Britain's survival for 20 months, through the fall of France, through the Battle of Britain, through the Blitz, through the U-boat war, through the desert campaigns. He had carried it knowing that without America, victory might be impossible. He had courted Roosevelt, had made speeches, had sent envoys, had done everything in his power to bring America into the war. And he had failed. America had remained neutral, until Japan solved the problem for him. The irony was not lost on Churchill. Britain's salvation came through Japan's aggression against America. The road to victory in Europe ran through Pearl Harbor. The answer to how to defeat Hitler was provided by Admiral Yamamoto's carrier strike force. But Churchill didn't dwell on irony. He focused on reality, and the reality was simple. America was in the war, and that meant the Allies would win. Everything that happened afterward, the conferences, the invasions, the battles, the ultimate victory, all of it flowed from that moment at Chequers when a butler brought in a radio and Churchill heard that Japan had attacked across all of Asia and the Pacific, including the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. The war would continue for 3.5 more years. Singapore would fall. Burma would fall. The Philippines would fall. But then the tide would turn. Midway, Guadalcanal, El Alamein, Stalingrad. The battles would shift from desperate defense to grinding advance. Allied armies would land in North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, then France. The bombing of Germany would intensify. The U-boats would be defeated. Japan would be pushed back, island by island, toward the home islands. And on May 8, 1945, Germany would surrender. On September 2, 1945, Japan would surrender. The war would be won. Churchill knew it would happen the moment he heard about Pearl Harbor. He couldn't have predicted the details, couldn't have foreseen exactly how the victories would come, but he knew the outcome. So we have won after all. Those words, written in his memoirs years later, captured the moment perfectly. The moment when desperation became certainty. when solitary struggle became grand alliance, when survival became victory. All because a butler brought a radio into a dining room at Checkers on a Sunday evening in December.